Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 16 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. Each week, we sit down with an historian to discuss their unique insights into our early American past so we can learn more about who we are and how we can affect a better future. You know, I have to laugh a little bit. My partner, Tim, thinks my hello and welcome to Ben Franklin's World is a little bit exuberant, but I just can't help it. He makes fun of me a little bit for it, but I just get so excited to talk about history. And today, I'm really excited because we have a very special guest. I am honored and pleased to introduce you to my friend and mentor, Alan Taylor, the Thomas Jefferson Chair of American History at the University of Virginia and a two-time winner of the Pulitzer Prize in United States history. Alan helped me hone my skills as an historian, and he guided my dissertation work through its completion. He also inspired me to accept the challenge of researching the complicated nature of New York's colonial and early state history. But today we won't be talking about New York. Today, Alan will lead us on an exploration of slavery and war in Virginia between 1772 and 1832. And we will discuss his newest book, The Internal Enemy, winner of the 2014 Pulitzer Prize for United States history. During our conversation, Alan will reveal what the Virginians' internal enemy was and why they feared it, how slaves lived and worked in Virginia between the late 18th and early 19th centuries, and how the Virginians' internal enemy assisted the British Army and almost cost the United States the War of 1812, its second war for independence. But first, I have a modern-day discovery to share with you.
After studying all the best available news, foreign and domestic, Liz has a modern-day discovery to share with you.
Did you know that Ben Franklin's World has its own private social community on Facebook? Poor Richard's Club of Wit and Wisdom is a place where you can discover more about our early American past and share your passion for history with other listeners of Ben Franklin's World. Membership is free. All you have to do is sign up for The Franklin Gazette, the official weekly newsletter of Ben Franklin's World. The Franklin Gazette will notify you about new episodes, and it will deliver the show notes for each episode right into your inbox. And you may also occasionally receive updates from me about the show and other history-related news I think you'd find interesting. You can sign up for both the Franklin Gazette and Poor Richard's Club at benfranklinsworld.com. Okay, let's get to our conversation about slavery and the War of 1812 with Alan Taylor.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Today we welcome Alan Taylor, the Thomas Jefferson Chair of American History at the University of Virginia. Alan is a two-time winner of the Pulitzer Prize for United States history and the author of 7 books, including The Civil War of 1812, American Citizens, British Subjects, Irish Rebels, and Indian Allies, and most recently, The Internal Enemy, Slavery and War in Virginia, 1772 to 1832. Alan is a native of Maine and a big fan of both the Boston Red Sox and the Celtics. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Alan.
Thank you, Liz. It's a pleasure to talk with you.
Now, I'm excited about our conversation today, and not just because we have the opportunity to discuss your fantastic Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Internal Enemy, but also because we get to exchange roles. As the advisor for my dissertation, you often had me into your office and peppered me with questions about my research and writing. And today, I get to have you into my virtual office and ask you a lot of questions about your research and writing.
Well, I hope I do as well as you did.
So before we dive into the history of the Internal Enemy, would you tell us a bit about yourself and how you came to research and write a history about slavery and war in Virginia?
Well, I started out from an unusual direction in that I was doing a book about Canada in the United States during the era of the War of 1812. And in the course of that, I did research at the Public Archives of Nova Scotia. And to my surprise, I found records of American former slaves who had become refugees during the War of 1812. And the government of Nova Scotia was settling them on lands around Halifax. And this was a story that I knew nothing about. Historians have written in some detail about the previous generation, the American Revolution, when former slaves were settled as refugees in Nova Scotia. But I had never seen anything about this wave of migrants after the War of 1812, and I wanted to know their story. I then had occasion to be a visiting professor at the University of Richmond in Virginia, and in the course of doing that, I explored around in the archives and found the story of these approximately 3,000 African Americans who managed to escape from slavery during the War of 1812 and helped the British during the war and then became refugees after the war.
Now, can we talk about the title of your book, The Internal Enemy? It's a phrase that appears many times throughout your book. So would you tell us what the internal enemy was and why Virginians feared it?
Well, when the War of 1812 erupted, Virginians knew that they would have an external enemy, the British Empire, which was the dominant naval power in the world. And Virginians knew that they were vulnerable because they were perched right there along Chesapeake Bay, which rendered them extremely vulnerable to naval power. But they also felt that they would be vulnerable to an internal enemy who would make common cause with the external enemy. And that internal enemy were their own slaves, who were approximately 40% of Virginia's population. And Virginians of that generation did not yet cultivate the misleading notion that slaves were happy and benefited from their slavery. On the contrary, Virginians could be much more frank in that generation and understood that slavery was exploitative and that the people held in slavery were their enemies, and that if those enemies found an opportunity to ally with an external power who could arm them and organize them for combat, that Virginians felt that they were in great trouble. And so they wrote and they spoke with great eloquence about feeling that they were caught between an external enemy and an internal enemy during the War of 1812.
So let's try to get at the heart of the Virginians' fears by exploring the lives of these internal enemies. What was life like for slaves in Virginia, and how did they work and live, and how were they treated?
Well, we tend to think of slaves as having one experience, and that is that they worked on large plantations as field hands. And when you look closely at Virginia society, you find that very few slaves led that particular life. There were plantation slaves, there were field hands, there were large numbers of field hands, but in the generation after the Revolution, the large slave holdings had mostly broken up through inheritance, through sale, and through renting out. So that much more common was for slaves to live on farms in groups of 2, 3, 4, and 5 slaves. In a county along Chesapeake Bay, the common pattern was that about half of the white families would own a slave, but usually 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 slaves, not what we imagine the hundreds of slaves. And then you would have an occasional plantation where you might find 50 or 100 slaves. The other half of the white population would often rent a slave, so that probably 3/4 of the households of white people would have either an owned slave or a rented slave, but those slaves were then dispersed in these much smaller groups. And often this dispersal disrupted family ties among African Americans, so that a husband and a wife would be working and living on separate farms. And their children, once they became teenagers, would be split up and living on different farms. And so it meant that African Americans, to have a family life and a community life, they had to travel between different farms, usually at night after their work was over. And so they became experts at understanding the landscape of these Virginia counties, particularly at night, knowing the paths and the streams by which that they could travel in order to maintain their connections with one another.
So in order to better understand what happens during the War of 1812, perhaps we should take a step back and go back to the American Revolution. In November 1775, the Royal Governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, issued a proclamation that tapped into the Virginian fear of the internal enemy. Would you tell us about his proclamations and his motives for using it?
Well, in 1775, the 13 colonies were erupting in rebellion, and they had not yet declared independence, but they were in the process of evicting their royal governors, and one of those royal governors was Lord Dunmore of Virginia. And he decided to fight back by trying to rally supporters, and he wasn't able to rally enough free white supporters, so in a measure of his desperation, he issued a proclamation which invited any indentured servants who would have been white and any slaves who belonged to patriot masters. He invited them to run away to join him on his warships, which were operating in Chesapeake Bay, and that he would arm them and free them. And this attracted a couple of thousand, maybe as many as 5,000 escaped African Americans who came as men, women, and children, more than he expected. And certainly he wasn't really in the business of recruiting women and children, but if he wanted to get men to serve in his forces, he had to take the women and children as well. And so Dunmore's success at attracting runaways, who included slaves who had escaped from George Washington's Mount Vernon, this was very alarming to Virginians because they saw it as just the beginning of a process. Washington referred to it as a snowball that would gather power as it went downhill. And so it became especially important to Virginians to do everything they could to try to drive Lord Dunmore out of Chesapeake Bay before he succeeded in destroying slavery by recruiting slaves to help him fight against the Virginians.
Dunmore's proclamation raises two questions for me. First, did Dunmore really free the slaves that went to him? Because I've heard and read in other places that he did not. And second, did the Patriots capture any of the runaway slaves, any of the slaves running away to Dunmore? And what happened to those slaves if they were caught running away?
Well, Dunmore was not a natural abolitionist by any means. He was offering this proclamation not because he was anti-slavery in principle, but because he was desperate for fighting men, and he recognized that these runaway slaves could be very effective as fighting men, and that they would be highly motivated because they would be fighting against their former masters. They had grudges to settle. Now, it became a standard feature of patriot counter-propaganda to tell their slaves that they could not trust Dunmore, and that Dunmore was really in the business of luring them away so he could sell them in the West Indies. But there is no evidence that Dunmore ever sold any of those slaves who came and enlisted in his forces. Now, that doesn't mean they all had a happy ending. The ending for most of them was quite a grim one, but it was because of an epidemic of smallpox that erupted in his military camps and ended up killing most of them. But those who did survive it were evacuated off to New York City, which was then under British occupation, and many of them survived the war and then became refugees in Nova Scotia. So we know of hundreds who ended up in Nova Scotia as refugees after the American Revolution. We know of none who were sold away to the West Indies from Virginia among those who rallied to Dunmore's call. Now, as to those who were captured by the Patriots, and some were, they were treated in a very grim fashion. They certainly were whipped within an inch of their lives. Some of them were killed and had their heads chopped off and their heads put on posts placed at crossroads to serve as a warning to other slaves that this is what will happen to you if you run away. Others were sent off to the lead mines in Fincastle County in western Virginia, where they would dig out this lead, which the Patriots needed to make into bullets to shoot at Dunmore and his men. And we don't know what happened to them after they were sentenced to the mines at Fincastle, but we can probably guess that most of them did not live long. And a few of them were actually sold off to the West Indies by the Patriots. So we know of some that the Patriots sold off to the West Indies. We know of none that Dunmore sold off to the West Indies.
Now, the American Revolution upended many colonial institutions, and you've alluded to the fact that Virginia's tradition of entail was upended. The end of that practice made the domestic lives of slaves more precarious. So would you describe what entail was and its entanglement with slavery, and what its end really meant for slaves and their families?
Well, entail is a legal term, and it was something that the owner of an estate could place on the estate in his or occasionally her will. And what it said was that the person inheriting the estate was then bound to preserve that estate intact and pass it on to the next generation, versus, for example, mortgaging the estate or selling it off to somebody else or subdividing it off and selling parts of it. All of these were forbidden under an entail. And there's an aristocratic logic to an entail, and it derived from the aristocratic legal system in Great Britain. It was a means by which aristocrats in Great Britain kept their estates together through the generations. And it was linked to another legal concept, primogeniture, which meant that one son, the oldest son, would inherit the estate and preserve it through the generations. And so it's bad luck for the other children, who might get some cash settlement or some other movable property, but they would not get the crown gem of an aristocratic estate, which is the land. And Virginia's planters of the 18th century were emulating this social model because they wanted to maintain that the principal member of their family in the next generation would still hold the very high social standing that came from owning a very large landed estate and the slaves that went with it. So these entails also stipulated that the slaves could not be sold away. Now, revolutionaries were trying to break with this aristocratic tradition, and they decided to do so by changing the laws in Virginia, making it much more difficult and, in most cases, illegal to have an entail linked to primogeniture. And the tendency then was, so if you're a large landholder and you've got 4 sons, then they're supposed to inherit equally, and that subdivides the property. And they become free after 1796 to also break entails on slaves, and as they are inheriting smaller properties and the slaves are being divided up, this is rupturing many slave families. And many of these heirs then don't have enough money to pay their debts. So they are then selling off some of their slaves to pay their debts and to raise capital to try to improve their funds. And the consequence of the breaking of entail and primogeniture in Virginia is that it is throwing many more slaves onto the market. They are available for sale to local people. And that's one of the reasons why you're finding that many more white Virginians are owning or renting slaves, because there are more available to them to buy or to rent. But these slaves are also ending up on a new long-distance market, which is developing after the Revolution, and particularly after 1807, in which thousands are being sold away to the Deep South to work on the new cotton plantations in places like South Carolina and Georgia and Tennessee and eventually Alabama and Mississippi. So that when you put it all together, you find that these legal changes that are made by the Revolution in Virginia, which are meant to promote greater equality among white men, does have that effect, but it also has a very negative impact upon African Americans, who find that their communities and families are being ruptured in ways that are new to them. And particularly the worst of all those ruptures is the long-distance sale that is sending thousands of Virginia slaves away to the even harsher slavery of the Deep South.
Well, I can certainly understand why this idea of the internal enemy develops. You have a population that, probably more than physical punishment, worries about their families being disseminated throughout the colonies, or that new United States, I guess I should say, or elsewhere. For many that their families would be totally disrupted. Now, you had mentioned earlier that Virginians were not in a mindset prior to the War of 1812 where they lived in this fairy tale land of we're good masters and slaves love us. Did they ever attempt to try and end the institution of slavery after the Revolution as some other states did?
Well, the states that did end slavery after the Revolution were entirely in the North, and they were places that had quite small populations of slaves when we compare them to the southern states. Southern states, it's fairly routine for a state for 40% of its population to be held in slavery. In the North, it's much closer to 4%, occasionally a notch higher in places like New Jersey and New York, but a notch lower in the New England states. And so it's a whole lot easier for those northern states to free their slaves because the property interest is a smaller one. There are fewer white men who are adamant about preserving the system. And even in the North, in most of the states, it's a very gradual plan that only frees slaves over the course of 2 generations. So that there are still a lot of slaves in, say, New Jersey and New York and even Pennsylvania into the 1820s. Now, in the South, they're not able to emancipate the slaves because they're essential to the economy. They're essential to people paying their debts, and the white people of the South are much more fearful of what's going to happen if we free the slaves and have them as free neighbors. And so this internal enemy notion led them to believe that they would be in great danger if 40% of their population were free blacks rather than held in slavery. So while they felt that holding slaves was dangerous, they thought having a lot of free blacks around would be more dangerous. Now, there's absolutely no evidence for this. In fact, free blacks were not a threat to whites, but whites believed this, and people act on their beliefs rather than reality. And so a consequence of this is that the only vehicle for becoming free was certainly not the action of the state legislature freeing the slaves, but it was that in 1782, the Virginia legislature made it a bit easier for individuals who owned slaves to free those slaves if they so chose by either a deed or a will. And this was called manumission. And this did modestly increase the free black population in Virginia. By 1810, it had grown to 7% of the black population, from less than 1% in 1782. But by 1810, Virginians were very alarmed by this growth of the free black population, and they decided they'd made a mistake in loosening the manumission law. So in 1806, they tightened the manumission law and essentially said, if you want to free a slave, you're free to do that, but you got to get them out of the state of Virginia within 1 year, or they go back into slavery. And at that point, most slaves wanted to be free, but they didn't want to leave Virginia because they had many family members and friends, and everything that they knew was in Virginia. What they wanted to be was free and in Virginia. And when the state of Virginia says, no, you can't have that, most masters decide that it would be kinder, in their very self-interested opinion, it would be kinder to keep the slaves in slavery and in Virginia. And so the freeing of slaves through manumission virtually dries up after 1806.
So now that we've explored the Virginian mindset towards slavery, let's look at the British mindset. We know that a lot of people in the 13 colonies decide they want their independence because they have a lot of differing viewpoints from those who live elsewhere in the British Empire. But after the Revolution, as Americans actually worked to further entrench the institution of slavery in their society, the British actually start to suppress the slave trade and weaken its practice in the decade after 1800. So, Alan, what caused the British to begin their suppression of the slave trade?
Well, there are a number of things. One is they lose a big chunk of their slaves and their slaveholders when the American Revolution succeeds. Now, that does leave them with an extensive slave society in their colonies in the West Indies, places like Jamaica and Barbados and Antigua. But that particular economic interest is smaller and less powerful after the Revolution than it was before. So on the other hand, you have a new interest which is emerging, which is driven by Christianity, particularly a more evangelical Christianity that could be found in parts of the Anglican Church, but could also be found among Methodists. And they start to organize in Great Britain a movement to try to mitigate slavery and hopefully lead to the abolition first of the slave trade, and then ultimately to lead to the end of slavery in the West Indies. And this movement starts to put a lot of pressure on Parliament. And so you have this political struggle between the interest of the West Indies and the slave traders on one side, and then this new abolitionist movement, which is driven by their religious principles in Great Britain. And it starts to achieve, the abolitionist movement starts to achieve some success in 1807 when they persuade Parliament to end the slave trade. And their belief is that once masters in the West Indies can no longer import thousands of new slaves every year, that this will oblige them to treat their current slaves with greater humanity rather than work them to death, which had been the standard in the West Indies. And this has some partial success, but ultimately this abolitionist group will pressure Great Britain through Parliament during the 1830s to emancipate the slaves in the West Indies. So Great Britain ends up being ahead of the United States, far ahead of the United States, in working against slavery during the 19th century.
And another way they seem to work against slavery is during the Napoleonic Wars, which took place between 1803 and 1815. The British Army is stretched thin, so they actually look to slaves in the West Indies to serve as soldiers. And they promised to give the black soldiers their freedom if they served honorably and for a full term of service. How did these black slaves perform in the British Army, and did their performance have a lasting impact on British imperial and military policies?
Well, these black soldiers who began as slaves, indeed, the British Army was in the business of buying the slaves, and also just taking slaves that they caught on these intercepted slave ships, and they wouldn't directly liberate them, but they would put the young men into military service and tell them that when your service is over, then you become free. But they had a freedom of sorts in the military in that they were paid. And they were treated just the same as white soldiers, though they couldn't become officers. And these black soldiers then become most of the troops that the British Empire posts in the West Indies. And they do so for a couple of reasons. One is that they are short on white soldiers. They have plenty of work for their white soldiers to do in Europe fighting against Napoleon there. But also, they felt that the black soldiers were better suited to the climate in the West Indies and were less likely to die of disease. And this was true. And they were also less likely to desert, to run away, because there they are in a slave society, so if they run away, their conditions will just be worse. They'll end up on some plantation. So the black soldiers turned out to have very good service records in that they didn't desert, they tended not to die of disease, and they fought very hard and very effectively. And so what had started as a small-scale experiment gets expanded to the point where black soldiers are most of the British troops in the West Indies. And this will then serve as a model that the British will apply when the War of 1812 breaks out. And they will then end up recruiting runaway blacks from the United States to serve in black units that are modeled on the black regiments of the West Indies.
Indeed, during the War of 1812, it seems like the British have embraced their opportunity to repeat history. In fact, they adopt a policy very similar to Lord Dunmore's 1775 proclamation. Would you share an anecdote or two about some of the slaves who escaped to the British during the War of 1812 and what their escapes were like?
Well, the slaves tended to be to operate in two stages. In the first stage, it would be small, and it would be a handful of slaves, would be young men who would succeed in stealing some boat and would go away to the British forces that were on these warships operating in Chesapeake Bay, and then persuade the British to then go and send boats ashore in the vicinity of where these initial runaways had come from, to try to take off much larger numbers of enslaved people to freedom. Or they would persuade the British to lead a raid by armed sailors and Marines that would go further into the countryside in order to raid these farms and plantations in order to enable even larger numbers of African Americans to escape. Now, probably the most dramatic of the escapes actually combined these two stages, in that a group of enslaved people in October of 1814 who were on the Virginia side of the Potomac, a few young men stole a canoe, but instead of going directly down the Potomac River looking for a British warship, they crossed the river to the Maryland side where there was a ferry boat, which they somehow extricated from its lock, and then went back to the Virginia shore of the Potomac and loaded up 17 people, men, women, and children. They needed a boat that was big enough for this larger group to escape in, and that's where the ferry boat came in. And somehow they pulled this off and managed to get away, having taken some property from their masters and what little property they had in their own huts. And they escaped from pursuit, and they reached a British warship. And then years later, the leader of this escape wrote a letter to his master, and this letter remarkably survives. And in this letter, the leader of that escape, a man named Bartlett Shanklin, briefly reviews the escape, but is also just telling the master, it's a very in-your-face letter, that how much better off this Bartlett Shanklin has become by gaining his freedom in Nova Scotia with the help of the British and with the help of his own ingenuity in engineering this remarkable escape with the ferry boat in October of 1814.
There were many stories in your book, The Internal Enemy, about men like Bartlett Shanklin. We don't typically have a lot of records about slaves written by slaves. How is it that you knew so much about the runaway slaves who appear throughout your book?
Well, I discovered a collection at the National Archives, kept in a place where you wouldn't expect to find a lot of evidence about American slavery. It was in the Secretary of State's records. And I think because it had been there and was an obscure collection, no previous historian had used this for a book. And so this collection just wasn't known. I didn't know about it. And I was just very lucky. There was an amateur historian based in London who had discovered it for his own purposes in writing about some of the refugees who went to Trinidad. And so I pursued the lead that he had provided and found that this collection was huge and stuffed full of fascinating documents, most of them generated by white people in Virginia and Maryland, but also Georgia and Louisiana and Alabama, who were submitting evidence to this claims commission set up after the war by the United States government to compensate masters who could present sufficient evidence showing that their slaves had not just escaped during the war, but had gone to the British. And in these remarkable files are some very rich descriptions of escapes and lists of slaves who went away and observations by their masters. But also I found 7 letters written by former slaves from Virginia or Maryland who are writing back to former masters or to family members left behind on these farms and plantations in Maryland and Virginia. And these 7 letters are probably the most extraordinary documents that I have had the good fortune to find in my career as a historian.
I have to imagine that the Virginians really wanted their slaves back because it's not just the labor they lost, but a lot of capital because they viewed slaves as investment. So I can only imagine how rich the records you found really are. So we have just a few minutes left, which means it is time for the time warp.
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
Normally, the time warp is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently. However, the week I read your book, the past and present seemed to come together, and I would like to ask you about this coincidence. So before I get to my question, here's the story that I read in your book that prompted me to think about past and present together. In May 1806, a white man named George Wythe Sweeney murdered the famed Virginian jurist George Wythe and his former slave, Michael Brown. The jury acquitted Sweeney because the only witness who could testify to seeing him put poison in Wythe and Brown's coffee was Wythe's housekeeper, a freed black woman. So fast forward 208 years later, we have a white police officer in Ferguson, Missouri, who shot and killed a young black man named Michael Brown. The grand jury decided not to indict or charge the police officer with a crime. So, Alan, here's my question. Does the legacy of slavery in Virginia and elsewhere in the United States contribute to our present-day race problems? And if so, would you give us your take on how?
Well, it's an easy answer to say that of course, the legacy of slavery contributes to our the many problems. I wouldn't say there's one problem, but the many problems that American society wrestles with that revolve around race. You had for generations people held in slavery, denied all economic opportunity, thoroughly exploited, treated as lesser forms of human beings, and distrusted, feared. Eventually, they became liberated, partly through their own efforts, partly through an alliance with the United States government during the Civil War, and there's still a legacy of that survived the Civil War among most Americans of regarding blacks as their inferiors and of fearing them and distrusting them. Now, certainly this doesn't describe all white people, but you would certainly say that at the end of the 19th century and deep into the 20th century, it described most white people. And I certainly would say that some remarkable progress has been made through the civil rights movement, but I don't think anybody would say that the races are equal in this country. And I think particularly there has been a problem, not just in the Ferguson case, but in many other cases, where white people on juries, grand juries, and trial juries will tend to trust the word of a white policeman or even a white vigilante more than they will trust the word of an African American. And this then leads to all sorts of cases where in the African American community, the evidence seems clear to them that a great injustice has been done. Whereas people on these juries and many people in the broader American white community would prefer to just trust the judgment of a white police officer in these cases. And so I don't think that the end of slavery with the Civil War has ended the legacy of racism in this country any more than it's ended the legacy of racism in other countries which had slavery.
You know, I hadn't really thought about it, but as you're talking about it, I realize that even today, white people and black people in the United States and others are still living with their own internal enemies that we still have to come to reckon with.
Well, I think that's true. I mean, I think African Americans have their own fears, and one would have to say there's substance to those fears. It's much more common for an African American who's just out driving their car and to find that they're in a neighborhood where they're going to be pulled over and checked, and so that this is very, very troubling, and to them. And probably should be troubling to us. I think it's very hard for people to set aside race. This is, I think, true of the great majority of Americans, whatever their color, to just entirely set aside race and treat people as individuals.
So before we conclude, would you tell us what aspect of history you are researching and writing about now?
Well, I'm writing a history of the American Revolution on the scale of the entire North American continent. And it's a story I'm going to take from about the 1750s until the start of the 19th century. And so I'm certainly going to tell the story of the emergence of the United States. That is the central story. But I'm also going to be putting this in the context of what impact this has on the whole continent, including the Loyalist refugees who end up in Canada or the Bahamas or the West Indies, and the impact on Spanish America, which at that time was everything west of the Mississippi River, and the impact on the Native Americans who still occupied most of the continent. And so the American Revolution really is a story that's even bigger than the creation of the United States along the Atlantic coast. And it is that bigger story that I'm hoping to tell.
Fantastic. And where is the best place to look for more information about you, your work, and how to get in contact with you?
Well, I'm at the History Department of the University of Virginia, and they have a website, and so there's information on me there. And that's probably the best place to start.
Well, Alan, I think you did a fine job at answering all the questions I peppered you with. So thank you very much for talking to us here on Ben Franklin's World.
Well, it's been my pleasure, Liz.
The United States almost lost the War of 1812, its second war for independence, because of Virginia's internal enemy. This is an incredible fact because many of the Chesapeake planters thought of their slaves as powerless, and they worked to keep them that way. But slaves weren't powerless. They found ways to resist their condition, and one of the ways they resisted slavery was to run away into the arms of the British Army during the War of 1812. And that action greatly impacted the war and almost cost the United States its independence. You can find information about Alan, his book, The Internal Enemy, plus everything we talked about today on the show notes page for this episode, which you'll find at benfranklinsworld.com/016. While you were checking out the show notes for this episode, don't forget to sign up for the Franklin Gazette. Not only will you receive the show notes for future episodes right in your inbox, but you will also gain access to Poor Richard's Club of Wit and Wisdom, the social community for Ben Franklin's World listeners. I would greatly appreciate it if you would rate this podcast. Your rating will help us keep Ben Franklin's World visible and findable for new people. To rate and review Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history, just visit benfranklinsworld.com/iTunes or benfranklinsworld.com/Stitcher. And finally, the United States claimed victory during the War of 1812, but so did the British. Who do you think won the war and why? Let me know your answer. Send me an email to liz@benfranklinsworld.com or tweet me @LizCovart.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.